She was an ordinary black girl, yet she was desperately pursued by a white boy who came from a privileged family and had a charming sense of humor. Other white girls tried to steal his heart, but the boy remained deeply in love with the black girl, Lena. Seeing the jealous and disdainful looks around her, Lena stayed silent. Although the boy kept trying hard to win her over, Lena never agreed to be with him, because she knew that her dark skin was not welcomed in this white-dominated country, wherever she went. On top of that, her family was poor, and she had to take on part-time jobs after school to help make ends meet. She knew she and the boy came from completely different worlds, divided by class and by color, and their love was destined to face hardship. One day, while working at a banquet, Lena unexpectedly saw the boy there. She quickly shook her head and gestured for him to pretend they didn't know each other, afraid that her identity as a black woman might bring him trouble. But the boy suddenly took her by the hand and led her away from the banquet. He told her he had enlisted in the army and would soon leave town for the front lines. Hearing this, the smile on Lena's face instantly faded. The truth was, she had long fallen in love with him, but because of all the pressure from the outside world, she had kept that love hidden deep inside. Now, as she faced the reality that he was about to leave her life, she could no longer suppress her feelings and kissed him first. At that moment, the two people who loved each other finally came together. However, the time they had to love each other was far too short. A few days later, the boy left his hometown and stepped into the chaos of war. From then on, Lena began a life filled with longing, waiting every day for the mail carrier to appear. It became the most important part of her daily routine. But more than 2 months passed, and she still hadn't received a single letter from him. Even though she hadn't heard from her boyfriend at the front, she never stopped writing, sending him a letter every week. She didn't know his unit number or where he was stationed, so most of her letters just piled up at home, undelivered. She stood by the door every day, watching, but never saw his familiar figure again. She lifted her head toward the sky, hoping the wind could carry her longing for him far away. Until one day, months later, the boy's father came to her with a letter. Lena slowly opened the envelope and found inside a notice from the army her boyfriend had been killed in action. She never imagined that after months of waiting, the news she would finally receive was his death. She sat on her bed, clutching the death notice, crying through the entire night. Heartbroken, she lay in bed for a week, then made a decision to give up school and enlist in the army. She wanted to go to the front lines, to see the places where her lover once fought, to feel the traces he had left on the battlefield. Her mother couldn't bear the thought of sending her only daughter into danger, but Lena's mind was made up, and despite her mother's pleas, she resolutely joined the army. With no other choice, her mother, full of sorrow, sent Lena off on the train that would take her away from home. Soon, Lena arrived at the new recruit training camp, and as soon as she got there, she met another black woman named Belle. Belle, who had already been at the training camp for over a year, fell in love with Lena at first sight. He immediately reached out his hand, wanting to help her off the truck. Seeing the sudden gesture of kindness, Lena stayed silent for a few seconds, then finally took his hand and jumped down from the military truck. Belle seized the moment to introduce himself, telling Lena that if she ever needed any help, she could call on him anytime. Facing his warm enthusiasm, Lena simply smiled politely in response, because at that moment, she was still drowning in the sorrow of losing her boyfriend. Her heart had been locked shut for him, and no one could easily open it again. It was because her boyfriend had died on the front lines that she gave up her studies and joined the army, driven by a desire for revenge and a wish to defeat the German forces. Fulfilling the dream her lover had left unfinished, she was assigned to an all-black women's battalion, the first of its kind, which immediately drew the media's attention. Many people are waiting to see this team fail. They believed that black people had no ability to fight and that these black women could never achieve any glory in battle. But the female officer leading them had great hopes for the unit. She wanted to prove those who looked down on black people completely wrong. That was why her standards for the team were extremely high, and the training was especially harsh. Lena, who had always been frail and physically weak, often became the target of her officer's scolding, and everything that happened to her was quietly watched by Belle, who had fallen for her at first sight. But to Lena, Belle was nothing more than an ordinary stranger, because her heart still belonged to her lover who had died on the battlefield. One day, the unit was training for chemical warfare. Two groups of female soldiers stood inside a sealed room, waiting quietly. The next moment, a smoke grenade was thrown inside, and everyone quickly put on their gas masks. But Lena, still lost in the grief of her boyfriend's death, was once again a step slower than the others. In the end, unable to endure the thick smoke in the room, She ran outside gasping for air. A reporter who had been following the team rushed over immediately, snapping photos non-stop. The furious officer shouted at Lena to get back inside, not wanting her to drag down the whole unit and become a laughingstock in front of the white audience. Sitting weakly on the ground, Lena listened to the officer's scolding, her heart full of guilt and self-blame. She wanted to be strong, to be brave, to become a worthy soldier on the battlefield, but she always fell short. In a daze, she suddenly saw the spirit of her fallen boyfriend standing beside the officer, looking at her with love in his eyes, encouraging her to stand up and believe in herself. Encouraged by him, Lena put her mask back on and walked resolutely back into the room. What Lena didn't expect was that after enduring months of grueling training and finally passing every test with her comrades, they still hadn't received any orders to go to the front lines. It was clear that the white-controlled government still refused to give black soldiers a fair chance. Determined to prove the strength of her people, the female officer personally went to the white commander to request a transfer to the front, but the commander coldly told her to wait for news, then used the excuse of an important meeting to dismiss her from his office. When new recruits finally went into battle for the first time, they were filled with tension, clutching their rifles and slowly moving forward through the trenches. He kept cheering himself on in his heart, finally gathering the courage to find a position and prepare for battle. Not long after, the commander gave the order for a full-scale attack, and as soon as the soldiers heard the command, they climbed out of the trenches. In an instant, the air was filled with deafening gunfire and the screams of the fallen. Watching his comrades collapse beside him, he froze in panic, gasping for breath. After a few seconds of hesitation, he finally stood up in anger and climbed out of the trench. Bullets flew past his ears like rain, and explosions thundered one after another. Ignoring the danger, he charged forward toward the enemy's position with all his strength. But suddenly, one of the fighter planes meant to cover their advance plunged from the sky, trailing a blazing streak of fire. Dazzling and tragic, he stopped running and rushed toward the crash site, struggling to pull the pilot out of the cockpit. But the man was already lifeless. From the soldier's backpack, he found a blood-stained letter meant for home, then carried that letter with him as he continued charging toward the German lines. When the battle finally ended, he was lucky to survive. Yet the sight of the brutal carnage haunted him deeply. He placed the blood-soaked letter into a bag already filled with other soldiers' letters meant for their families. Before long, dozens of mailbags stuffed with letters were loaded onto a military truck. The blood-stained letter left the camp that day, heading toward the rear lines. No one knew how long the truck had been driving when it finally arrived at an air base, where soldiers unloaded the mail and tossed it into an empty hangar. Inside, thousands upon thousands of letters had already piled up into mountains, too many to be sorted or delivered on time, and many of them had been sitting there for over half a year, while all those letters lay forgotten and decaying in the hangar. Across the ocean in a small town, every morning a mother stood at her door, waiting eagerly for the mailman to appear. She had been anxiously waiting for a letter from her son at the front, but after more than 5 long months, not a single one had arrived. Each disappointment pierced her heart with sorrow, and behind her, beside the wooden house, stood the father and younger sister, waiting in silence. At last, the desperate mother made her way to the area near the White House, hoping to find out whether her son was still alive. She refused to believe that her kind and dutiful son could have spent over 5 months on the front lines without writing even one letter home. Although many officials passed by that area every day, none paid attention to this grieving mother, until one stormy night a few days later, she finally caught the attention of the First Lady. The First Lady walked out holding an umbrella and asked the woman if she was in trouble. Seizing the chance, the mother took out her son's photograph and told the First Lady about the heartbreaking fact that she hadn't received a single letter from him. She also told her that she had discovered many other families just like hers, all waiting endlessly for letters that never came. She pleaded with the First Lady to help her, to show compassion for a mother suffering from longing and worry. Moved by her story, the First Lady, herself a mother, gently comforted her and promised to do everything in her power to help. A few days later, the president held a brief meeting, asking his staff why so many soldiers on the front lines and their families back home could not exchange letters. His staff quickly explained that the war situation was critical, manpower was scarce, and because the front was separated from them by an entire ocean, every ship and truck had to be used to transport supplies and the wounded, which caused severe delays in mail delivery. But the president refused to accept that excuse and demanded that they fix the problem immediately, insisting that letters from home were vital for maintaining morale and strengthening soldiers' spirits. The First Lady added that as a mother, not receiving a letter from one's own child could make it impossible to focus on work. If countless mothers across the country lost that peace of mind, it could disrupt domestic production and even affect the entire course of the war. Under pressure from both the president and the first lady, the general reluctantly promised to resolve the backlog of mail as soon as possible, but by that time, nearly 20 million letters had already piled up, and every officer knew that this was an exhausting task that brought no glory, so no one was willing to take it on. This female officer never imagined that while she poured her heart and soul into training her soldiers, hoping they would complete all training programs and then rush to the battlefield to fight enemies and earn glory, the white commanders still refused to issue any orders to deploy troops to the front lines. To win a chance to prove the strength of black soldiers, she personally went to the white commander's office, but he simply said coldly, "Go back and wait for news," and then dismissed her, claiming he had an important meeting. Frustrated and angry, the female officer had no choice but to take her troops to the cinema to pass the time, and Lena followed along with the other women. There, she suddenly noticed Bell, the man who had always shown her kindness, standing in front of the theater, staring at her quietly. The other female soldiers quickly took the hint and left, giving Bell the opportunity to speak to Lena alone. Bell seized the moment, trying every way he could to get closer to her, but Lena was still drowning in the pain of losing her lover, and in response to Bell's kind words, she only smiled politely. Even though Lena barely paid attention to him, Bell's warmth never faded. He followed her into the theater and deliberately sat beside her. But just as the movie began, a white officer who looked down on black soldiers appeared, shouting angrily for them to leave and give up their seats. Because he outranked them, neither Lena nor Bell spoke up. But fortunately, the female officer was seated nearby. Enraged, she stood up and ordered the white officer to leave, declaring that her own rank was higher and demanding that he salute her. The white officer, who had always despised black people, replied coldly, "I will never salute a black woman." With that, he and his companion turned and stormed out in anger, still burning with rage not only because her unit had been denied the chance to fight but now, because of this open humiliation. The female officer once again went to the white commander's office. She reported that her soldiers had just been insulted in the theater and directly named the two white officers who had caused the trouble. But before she could finish her words, the commander interrupted her and told her to be quiet. Yet she refused to back down, insisting on demanding equal rights for her black soldiers. Unexpectedly, the commander suddenly told her, "Take your women and report to the European front as soon as possible." Hearing those words, the officer who had long dreamed of proving the worth of her people was overwhelmed with joy, and all the humiliation she had just endured instantly felt meaningless. The commander then handed her an envelope, telling her it contained their specific mission, but she was to open it only upon arrival. Overjoyed, the female officer led more than 800 black women onto a ship bound for Europe, sailing without any escort vessels. The massive waves and constant rocking of the ship made many of the women who had never traveled by sea violently seasick, but determined to reach the battlefield and prove that black soldiers were no less than white ones. They all endured the suffering without complaint. After a long and exhausting voyage, they finally arrived at the European front. Filled with pride, the female officer assembled her troops, ordering every woman to give her absolute best. Because this was the first time an all-black women's battalion would appear before the world, she wanted to leave the strongest impression possible and make those who mocked them swallow their words in shame. As soon as they landed, they marched straight toward their assigned base without rest. Their synchronized steps and disciplined formation carried them through the ruined streets, and everyone they passed stopped to watch, awed by the sudden appearance of this confident, dignified all-black women's unit. The soldiers thought that the moment had finally come for them to take up their weapons and prove that black people were no weaker than whites. But when they arrived, they discovered their mission was not to fight on the battlefield at all. Instead, their job was to sort through mountains of undelivered mail. Hearing this news, the spirits of every woman in the unit instantly sank. Lena, who had joined the army hoping to fight bravely on the battlefield and avenge her fallen lover, was instantly overwhelmed by deep disappointment. It was clear that even though they had completed every stage of military training, the white commanders still looked down on them, refusing to believe that black women were capable of going to the front lines. Nearly 20 million letters had piled up here, waiting to be sorted and forwarded, and more mail kept arriving every day. Yet the white officers who wanted to make things difficult for them gave them only 6 months to finish the job. Faced with such deliberate obstacles, the female officer was furious inside. But as a soldier, she forced herself to stay calm and tried to soothe her troops' anger. To make matters worse, the building assigned to them as a workspace turned out to be a bombed-out school. Broken walls, shattered glass, debris everywhere, and the only usable hall was packed with junk. To start working, the women had to spend precious time cleaning the ruined place first. Through the soldiers' tireless effort, a clean and organized workspace finally stood before them. Soon after, they began the grueling process of sorting mail. Endless piles of letters were transported from the hangars at the airfield to their new headquarters. While everyone was busy working, Lena suddenly shouted angrily at the others. It turned out that many of the letters had been sitting for so long that they were damp, torn, or chewed by rats, and the women often found stray military dog tags scattered among them. Some of the soldiers casually tossed these tags into a box, but the sight of it broke Lena's heart. It reminded her of her lover who had died at the front. She couldn't bear the thought that someone like him might have his tag thrown away so carelessly, and overcome with grief, she scolded the others in tears. The strength she had been forcing herself to maintain finally shattered, and she ran into the bathroom, crying uncontrollably. Even now, she still couldn't bring herself to accept that her lover was truly gone. A few of her friends followed, gently trying to comfort her. After their repeated concern and questioning, Lena finally confessed the truth that her boyfriend had died in the war. At that moment, her friends finally understood why the quiet and kind Lena had lost control and shouted earlier. Their conversation was overheard by the stern and disciplined female officer, who, for the first time, spoke to Lena in a soft, comforting tone. The reason she did so was because she had been secretly bitter about not being able to lead her unit into combat and was frustrated to be stuck sorting mail. But at that moment, she suddenly realized how meaningful their mission truly was. They were the bridge connecting the soldiers fighting desperately on the front lines with the families waiting anxiously across the ocean. Their hard work sorting, organizing, and delivering those letters would bring comfort and hope to thousands of broken hearts. Under the officer's guidance, the women began to understand the importance of what they were doing. Their resentment faded, replaced by determination, and they devoted themselves wholeheartedly to their work. One day, while sorting mail, one of Lena's friends suddenly found a blood-stained letter. The recipient's name on the envelope was Lena. The moment she saw it, Lena's heart surged with emotion, grief, longing, and fear all colliding at once. She had dreamed for so long of receiving the letter her lover had sent before he died. Yet now that it was finally in her hands, she was too afraid to open it. After days of hesitation, one evening about a week later, she went to a small gathering with her friends and unexpectedly saw Belle, the man who had never stopped caring for her. Belle was just as warm and attentive as before, while Lena, still lost in the sorrow of her loss, responded with her usual polite smile. But Belle, persistent as ever, refused to give up. He earnestly asked Lena to dance with him. Lena hesitated for a moment, then finally agreed. But as soon as the music began to play, the image of her lover appeared vividly before her eyes. Unable to suppress her grief any longer, Lena turned and quickly left the party. Belle stood frozen, watching her walk away in silence, completely confused. After a few seconds of hesitation, he made up his mind and ran after her. Seeing Lena's tearful face, he gently asked if he had said something wrong or done something to upset her. At that moment, Lena finally opened up and told Belle, "I've never stopped missing my boyfriend. Even though he died in the war, I just can't bring myself to start a new relationship. I know you truly care about me, but my heart right now belongs only to him. There's no room for anyone else." She spoke honestly, telling Belle her feelings and thoughts clearly, because she didn't want him to waste his time waiting for something that might never happen. But Belle, determined as ever, told her softly that he could wait no matter if it took a month, 2 months, a year, 10 years, or even a lifetime. Looking at the man standing before her, so steadfast in his love, Lena fell into deep silence. Half a month later, Belle came to find Lena again. He took her to a cemetery. Since the night of the party, Belle had secretly been searching for her boyfriend's grave, knowing that Lena had countless words left unsaid to the man she loved. Following Belle's directions, Lena walked slowly forward, her tears already streaming uncontrollably down her face. And then she saw at the grave of the man she had missed day and night. She collapsed to her knees before his headstone and wept for a long, long time. At last, she gathered the courage to open the letter she had never dared to read.
Dear Miss Lena, Vector Niner here. I don't want to cause you concern, but for the first time I think that the reality of me not making it home may be sinking in. I know I asked you to wait for me, and knowing you, you will. But if I don't make it back, please live your life with the laughter that you had in that rumble seat, that kind of freedom and fun. Look for me in the skies. Yours forever.
By the time she finished, her face was soaked with tears. No matter how much she cried, She knew that her lover was gone forever, gone from her life for all eternity. After months of tireless effort, the all-black women's battalion finally completed their mission of sorting the massive backlog of mail. They cleared nearly 20 million letters in just over 3 months, more than 2 months ahead of schedule. Thanks to their hard work, soldiers on the front lines and their loved ones across the ocean were finally able to reconnect. When the battalion, long despised and underestimated by many, finished their task and prepared to leave, they received a moving farewell. A group of white soldiers, whose hearts had changed after witnessing their dedication, came to the station and saluted them in silence, a gesture of respect and gratitude. For the first time, the black women who had endured endless discrimination earned the applause and recognition they deserved. Not through words, but through their actions. When the war finally ended, Lena and Belle found their way back to each other and began a new chapter of life and love. I'm a movie enthusiast. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next story.